Thanks for checking out my video. My name's Olivia and I'm going to talk about some spring themed eyeshadow palettes today. So I'm going to preface this video by saying I have an incredibly large eyeshadow palette collection. It's embarrassing. But if I mentioned every palette that I own that has like spring vibes or the color stories, we'd be here talking for 2 days. So my strategy kind of going into this was to pick the first ones I found that kind of give off that vibe with the color story or the theme or whatever it is. And I managed to narrow it down to 15 for this video. This is also like the most random assortment of palettes and brands. There's a little bit of indie, a little bit of mainstream here. There's some big and small palettes. So I feel like we have a good selection to talk about today. Yeah, I'm excited to show you the palettes I picked out. If that sounds like something you might be interested in, then just keep watching. So I'm going to start off with the palette that I'm wearing on my eyes today. I did film this look. It will be in an upcoming or already on my channel video. And I feel like this is like an unexpected choice for spring, but it's the Beauty Bay Bright 2.0 palette. So it's got 42 shades, which is a lot. And I say it's unexpected because I feel like a lot of these more saturated colors would actually be like really nice and fitting in the summer too, like especially these like bright pinks down here, the yellow and browns. And then I feel like some of the deeper colors would actually be good for fall even. Honestly, with 42 shades, I feel like you should be able to use the palette for all seasons, like no matter what your inspiration is, it should really kind of give you everything you need. And this palette does. For today's look, I was originally inspired to do something with like a green, orange, yellow combo. I kind of shied away from the orange a little bit and went a little darker, but that was kind of the inspiration. So it was meant to be more of like a spring kind of look, although it might have gotten away from me a little bit. But I digress. This palette is really beautiful. I've used it a couple times so far. There are a couple more looks that I have in mind that I'm planning on filming, so I'm looking forward to dabbling in it a little bit more. But yeah, it's got a really nice range. It goes from really light to really dark. The mattes so far performed really well. I've only used 1 or 2 of the shimmers so far, and I will say I'm not that impressed, but it is a Beauty Bay palette and they're not super expensive. And personally, I feel like, honestly, I can't hold this up anymore. My arm's hurting. But for me, I feel like I'm a little bit more of like a matte person. I really like to build the foundation of my looks using mattes. And for me, in a palette, if the mattes perform really well and the shimmers are more like mid, I can get past that, again, especially for the price of this and for the amount of options you're getting. But yeah, this is the first spring-inspired palette that I chose. So I may as well get the next kind of large palette out of the way. The next one I wanted to talk about is the Lime Crime Venus XL2. And the palette looks like this. I'm sorry the packaging is a little reflective. It might be a little annoying. But I feel like this color story like truly exemplifies spring. I feel like the light pinks and greens really complement each other so well. The shimmers in this palette honestly are stunning. I know Lime Crime isn't really making eyeshadow palettes anymore, which is unfortunate. I still wanted to talk about the palette because I feel like I have it. So just because they stopped making it, I don't want to stop using it or talking about it. Personally, I feel like they were a little underrated. I know some of their palettes were a lot less popular than others, but I really like this one. Most of the shimmers in it are actually pretty punchy. They're not super like thick and opaque, but the formula for most of them is almost like a sheer but super sparkly type of shadow. I think it's really flattering on the lids, and while the mattes don't go super deep, I mean, you do have this shade to kind of build up some depth. But really when I think of like spring looks, I kind of think of this color story, and I'm usually also more inspired to do like maybe more light washes of color, like not today obviously, but I do really enjoy that the shade selection in this is a little more like light to mid-tone. And again, the sheer like sparkly types of shimmers really just tie everything in together, and I think this is a great option for spring. I have another one from Lime Crime here, so I guess I'm just on a Lime Crime kick now. This is their like OG Venus palette. I think this is the first one they came out with. And this to me is like the opposite side of the spectrum when I think of spring. So these are kind of like, I feel like the 2 vibes I go for a lot in the spring. Usually like a light wash, maybe something green and pink. Or I'll focus on like kind of the peachy pinks, maybe some neutrals. So I feel like this is also a nice option for spring. There aren't any of those like punchier shimmers like in the Venus XL2 palette. These are definitely a lot softer and almost a little more satiny. So they're a little less impressive, but at the same time, I feel like this kind of formula is also really flattering. And also the packaging on these palettes, like, these were nice. I don't know, I've always really liked Lime Crime's eyeshadows. I feel like their themes, the packaging, everything was always really creative. It's too bad they're no longer doing makeup. I think they're just doing hair care now. But anyway, again, like, I have these, so I'm gonna keep using them. I really enjoy them. I also forgot to mention too, they do have like the Venus Original XL, which is basically like this palette, just larger. I don't know why I'm telling you as if you can go buy it, but I have that palette as well. I just kind of wanted to stick to these two today. But if you happen to have that one would also be a really good option for this time of year. The next palette I wanted to talk about is the Odin's Eye and Spring Dragon palette. This was from their second round of collabs that they did with a bunch of different creators. This one was their collab with Judy. And this palette's obviously very spring. I mean, it's also titled the Spring Dragon, but it is a pastel palette, and I feel like pastels are really perfect and fitting for the spring season. Again, like I mentioned with the Lime Crime palettes, I like having sometimes just like a light wash of color on the eyes, maybe with like a light but dewy base. I feel like that's kind of like a go-to look I might do if I'm inspired to do something more spring. I think this is the only like true pastel palette that I brought out for the video. Again, if I brought them all, I feel like we would have been here forever. It might be fun to do like a little collection video of like all my pastel palettes, for example. If you'd be interested in that, you can let me know. But I did want to keep it kind of narrowed down for the video, so I went with this one. I've only used this a couple times so far, and they were for like pretty basic looks. They weren't like too complicated. I haven't had any issues with the palette. I've heard like some mixed reviews online, but I like the couple of looks I did. I thought the shimmers especially were super pretty in this palette, and I feel like it's just a good time to get some more use out of it. So I didn't want all of the palettes in this video to be super similar, so I kind of wanted to pick a little bit of a different option to mix it up, and I went with the Tribe palette by Juvia's Place. Honestly, I feel like this would also qualify as like a fun palette for fall. It is a little bit grungier, especially with this like kind of pukey green shade here and the darker greens here. You can definitely get some nice fall looks out of this, but I feel like if a palette has like any combination of like different undertones of greens, including like a chartreuse here, plus an orange, to me that like kind of inspires me to do something like bright and fresh, and it kind of gives me like spring feels a little bit. So I did want to include it in this video. And at the same time, if you want to do something like kind of spring themed, but also like maybe a little darker, maybe a little grungier than what you've been doing, I feel like this palette will give you that versatility. So why don't we jump into some more like mainstream palettes to talk about. This next one is probably one of the most boring palettes in this selection, but also in my collection. But it's the Tartelette in Bloom palette. I'm sorry, I feel like all of the ones I picked for today have reflective packaging. But yeah, this isn't maybe necessarily like a spring inspired palette, but I feel like if there is a time where I'm inspired to do something super basic and minimal, like what you get with this palette, it's probably going to be in the spring, especially with the specific tones in this palette. You have like a little bit of a cooler tone row, then a row of like true neutral colors, and then this bottom row has like very slight like pinky or like mauve tones. So again, I feel like if I'm doing something really basic with like a palette like this, I would mostly be inspired to reach for it in the spring. In the fall time and even the winter, I kind of like doing something a little darker, maybe a little deeper with some jewel tones, something really shifty on the eyes. In the summer, I feel like I'm drawn to either like bronzy tones or like really punchy colors and not something like this. To be honest, I forget that this palette exists, and I feel like, again, now is probably the best time for me to push myself to reach for it, because I've had it for a little while. I do want to show it some love. And I mean, it is the Tartelette in Bloom, so I feel like bloom, spring, now's the time. Now's the time. It also smells delightful. So I have another mainstream palette that also smells delightful, and it's the Too Faced Sweet Peach palette. First of all, packaging, A+. I feel like I miss the innovation of OG Too Faced. But anyway, this is what the palette looks like. The color story is pretty comparable to the Lime Crime palette. So again, you kind of have the similar vibes. You have some pinky tones, a pop of peach there. There's like this kind of muted sage green that I find really kind of interesting. I would say the shimmers aren't quite as like textured or punchy as the ones in the Lime Crime palette, but I feel like this is a really nice option for every day. I kind of mentioned in my last like palette video that I do kind of like doing more like subdued looks, especially if I'm going to work in the office. And I feel like this palette kind of gives you that. You really don't have to think too hard about a look you're gonna do. I would say just about all the shades in here are pretty neutral, like minus maybe like 1 or 2 pops of a muted color anyway. This definitely isn't like a colorful palette, but I feel like it's colorful for what Too Faced had to offer back in the day when this came out. But I feel like that's also kind of what makes this palette interesting. Like these midtones and deeper shades here are all pretty neutral, but there is like a little bit of interest in the undertones. So I feel like this is still a fun little palette to reach for, especially if you're not going for like something like this for work. I feel like this is a nice little option. The next palette I want to talk about is the Urban Decay Wild Greens palette. So it opens up like this, and this is the color story. Also a pretty similar color story to what was in the Lime Crime palette, as well as the Too Faced Sweet Peach palette. I feel like Urban Decay committed a little more to the greens, although it is called the Wild Greens palette. I remember when this palette came out and it got a lot of mixed reviews online. And honestly, for those who didn't think this was a good palette, you're wrong. I'm just kidding. Everyone's entitled to their opinions, but you're wrong. I honestly think this palette is beautiful. As I mentioned before, clearly I'm drawn to this kind of color story. And to be honest, there aren't a lot of palettes I've come across that I've truly disliked. I think I'm just really easy. So naturally, I like this one too. But I really don't have a lot of complaints with this palette. Obviously, these aren't the most punchy, saturated mattes. It's not the most versatile or innovative color story, but I feel like it's a solid palette. I just feel like if you go into this palette wanting or expecting a lighter wash of green or maybe just a really flattering kind of peachy neutral, that's exactly what you're gonna get. And I feel like this palette delivers it well. Sure, you're not getting like indie quality shimmers or like moon dust quality shimmers that Urban Decay puts out, but I feel like these shimmers do still pack a punch. And I just feel like if you don't have super deep saturated mattes, I don't really need the thickest, most intense eye-catching shimmer. Sometimes I just want a light dusting of some sparkle, and I feel like this palette gives it to me. I suppose I can sympathize as to why this might not be someone's like top palette, but every time I look at this palette and use it, I just feel like it's so pretty, and I feel like all the colors in here go really well together. And I feel like if you have this palette in your collection, you should use it and not declutter it. And don't argue with me. Also, I really just love the theme they went for the packaging. I don't know, like I said, I'm really easy, but I'm self-aware. The next palette I wanted to mention is the Pat McGrath Mothership Rose Decadence palette. Honestly, can she just like chill with the names? I feel like all of her palettes sound the same. First of all, they're all Mothership. Half of them are all rose something. They're all decadent or celestial or something. I feel like they all just kind of mesh together in my brain now, and I don't know which one's which. It also doesn't really help that many of them look the same, but I digress. Now, I chose this palette for the video because I feel like it gives me like the pinky, purpley, maybe peachy vibes for spring, but to me it's like going out for like a date night during the spring. So I still have like the tones and colors I might want to reach for, but there's a little more depth with these shadows. So again, if I'm going on like a date night during the spring and I want something a little sexier, this palette kind of gives me that. I don't really have much else to say about the palette. I mean, it is only 6 shades, but I feel like within the 6 shades, there is enough versatility where you could do a couple different looks, and I need an excuse to reach for it again. The next palette I wanted to talk about is the somewhat infamous, not really, but maybe a little bit, Natasha Denona Zendo palette. This is what the color story looks like. I say infamous because I feel like it got a lot of mixed reviews when it came out. I think a lot of people had issues with like mostly the blue section here, but nonetheless, I wanted to highlight it for this video. I feel like it does go with kind of like the spring theme. It has like a similar color stories to some of the other palettes I mentioned, because it does offer some pinks, some peachy shades, and then like lighter greens and blues. But I feel like the undertones within this palette are a little bit different than the ones offered in the other palettes I mentioned. I think the blues, in addition to the green, offer something just like a little bit extra for this palette. There's just a little bit more you can do with it compared to the other palettes. There's also a couple of bronzy tones and then the gold and the red here. And I think those make this like a really nice transition palette for spring going into summer. As I mentioned earlier in this video, in the summertime at least, I tend to gravitate to either like bronzy looks or bolder pops of color. So yeah, I feel like you could really kind of keep this palette in your rotation for several weeks, honestly, if you like it, that is. Again, just because you have those like peachy green tones that I gravitate to for spring, and then again, some like deeper bronzy tones if you wanted to wear this into the summer as well. Obviously, you can wear any colors or any palettes at any time of the year. I just think it's fun to take some inspiration by the season sometimes. And again, like sometimes I forget I own some of these palettes, so I feel like if I'm inspired to reach for a particular palette at a certain time of the year, I want to take advantage of it, and I'm going to keep this one around for a little while. So I'm going to jump back into some indie palettes now. And I did this in my last little palette video, but I think it'd be fun to highlight another option from my basket of shame. So this is the Game Beauty Adventure palette, and I haven't used it yet. I only have one other palette from Game Beauty. I forget what it's called, but there's a little more blues in it. I think there's a pop of pink. And I will say I liked the couple of looks that I've done with that palette so far, so I feel like I won't dislike this one. I love the packaging too. I feel like they do really cute themes. The designs are always really fun and interesting. But I guess I'll show you the inside of it now. So this is the color story, and for me it's very spring. Clearly I'm drawn to greens and light colors at this time of the year. I wanted to reach for this one, first of all because it's in my basket of shame, but also because it offers something just a little bit different than the other palettes I pulled for. I really like the pop of orange in here, and I feel like the yellow will go with the rest of the palette really well too. I'm pretty sure this shade is a pressed glitter, which I don't always love because I don't tend to use those on like a day-to-day. However, I will dabble in a pressed glitter. I feel like that didn't deter me from wanting to reach for this palette, so I thought I'd pull it out for this month. The next palette I wanted to talk about is the Unearthly Cosmetics Bunnies palette. First of all, let's just appreciate this beautiful packaging. Honestly, everything about the Unearthly like vibe and aesthetic is just so like interesting and fun. I always love seeing what she comes out with. And this palette is obviously no exception. I really love the artwork on the cover. And I also really love the inside. I feel like this is one of the more like interesting and unique color stories from the palettes I reached for today. And I feel like it's a perfect option for like spring, also going into summer. I wouldn't necessarily describe these as pastels. To me, I feel like it's more of like just a really bright, fun palette. You definitely do like a lot of interesting, fun looks by mixing and matching the colors together. But I do really enjoy how it's also kind of set up in little duos if you wanted to do something like colorful and impactful, but also easy. If you wanted to do just like a really fun pop on the lid, a really like impactful dimensional shimmer, and then a winged liner, it is very specific, but it's a really fun look that I like to do, especially in the spring. But I feel like because of the colors in the palette, the depth of the colors, and just the really nice dimensional quality of the shimmers, I feel like this palette is like perfect for those kinds of looks. Also, if you go into the mattes like really lightly as opposed to like packing them on, you can definitely get like a lighter wash too if you don't want something super punchy. And at least for me, that's like one way that I like to kind of incorporate color if I'm going into the office. It doesn't have to be super bold. Again, the shimmers are really dimensional. I think you can get a really beautiful look that way. But of course, if you want to do something more interesting, you could really pack these on and again mix and match and do something a little more fun as well. So the next palette I'm going to mention, honestly, it's probably one of my favorite palettes that I'm going to talk about in this video. Well, no, they're all my favorite, but I really love this one a lot too. And I'm sorry if I butcher the accent, but this is the Fête de Provence palette from Nomad Cosmetics. And this color story is like the epitome of spring. This is like spring in a palette, maybe with like just a little bit of grunge sprinkled in with these two columns here. And it's just so pretty. I just love looking at it. The embossings are so cute. The color story is beautiful. You can get something really bright and flirty with this color story with the pinks and the pops of yellow. But then again, you can also mix it up. You can get something a little more grungy, a little more dark if you wanted to use this side of the palette here. You can also obviously mix them together. That would be a really fun option and give you a really interesting look. I like that there's a couple different shimmer formulas in here. This one's a little more like smooth and subdued, I would say, but it's so flattering. And then these are like maybe a little chunkier, but I don't mean chunkier as like a negative. I think they're really impactful and beautiful on the eyes. And yeah, this one just really makes me happy to look at and to use. I just think Nomad did a really good job with this color story just because of those different directions you could take it. It is a very versatile palette and a very unique color story. And again, I just get so happy when I look at it and when I use it. Just look at that. look at the little embossings. So yeah, as I mentioned 1 or 2 times, I'm pretty easy, but I do really enjoy this palette and I think it's a good one. So the last couple of palettes I have to mention are from ColourPop. I have a pretty large ColourPop collection alone, so I found it really difficult to narrow down my palettes. Honestly, I feel like I have 9 or 10 palettes from ColourPop that really fit the theme and the vibe of spring, but I didn't want this to be a ColourPop video. If you'd want that, let me know. But I did narrow it down to 2. So the first one I'm going to mention is the So Very Lovely palette from ColourPop. This is what the color story looks like. To me, it's not a fun, punchy spring palette. To me, it's more of a soft, romantic, and flirty type of spring palette. Does that make any sense? I guess to me, a bright green is more of an out there or fun shade. So palettes that have that, again, still give me the spring vibes, but they're a little more fun and adventurous. This one still does definitely give me the spring vibes. Again, it's just a little bit more flirty and soft. The bright wash of color. You have some peachy tones along with some kind of rosier neutrals here. The pop of lavender definitely adds a more fun element to the palette, but I don't know, my brain kind of thinks of purples and even lavenders as more wearable colors. So this kind of color story I'd be more drawn to for day-to-day looks, something more simpler, something more wearable or toned down. It does give you a little bit of depth with this corner here if you want to do something a little more impactful, so I do appreciate that. I don't know, I think I sound kind of harsh on this palette, and I don't mean to. I think it's really beautiful. Again, I think the color story obviously is very fitting for spring, and you certainly can do something a little more bright and punchy if you wanted to play with these 2 shades. I feel like it's just it's an approachable punchy. I don't know, anyway, I think it is a really beautiful palette, and I am really excited to reach for it. Can you guess what the last palette will be that I'll mention today? The first hint that I already mentioned is that it's ColourPop. The second hint is that it's a mega palette. So I had to pick the Getting Fresh palette. And if you couldn't guess by the first 95% of this video, I'm really drawn to bright pops of green for spring. And this palette clearly offers that. It's obviously not a green heavy palette. There's only a few different pops here, and I feel like it could have done with maybe 1 or 2 more green mattes. This one's hardly a green matte. Honestly, it just kind of looks like a taupe or maybe a khaki taupe. Although I don't really know why I'm complaining. I feel like the whole color story is actually really pretty. I actually really enjoy the combination of the neutrals with a couple of the peachy tones and then some greens. There's a couple pops of pink as well, which I feel really fit into the palette nicely. It's obviously a really versatile palette, kind of like the Beauty Bay one. It's pretty huge. I think there's 30 shades in here. But yeah, I feel like this palette offers a lot, both with the range of depth, but also with those few pops that I mentioned. I feel like there are a lot of different directions you could take it. And I feel like because there's so many neutrals scattered in, I feel like it makes the pops of colors very approachable. All of the tones really go together well, and if you wanted to stick to the columns to make a look, I feel like for the most part you'd get something pretty cohesive every time. And I really like when palettes are designed to do that for you. I feel this palette is a little bit more interesting than what you'd initially expect to. There are a couple of duochrome shades here. Obviously, it's ColourPop, so you're not going to get some next level indie quality duochrome, but I feel like these are still really nice to play around with. And then I also really like how you have these kind of almost thicker bronzy shimmers too. As I mentioned with some of the other palettes too, I feel like this also makes it a nice transition palette if you wanted to bring it into the summertime, or again if you wanted something just a little deeper and darker for a date night or something sexier. Overall, I really enjoy this palette. There are a couple of shades, especially between some of the neutrals, that seem a little bit redundant, but overall I've really enjoyed the looks that I've created so far, and I'm really excited to create some more. Alright, well I think that's going to wrap it up for this video. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you disagree with any of the palettes that I picked today? Are there other palettes from some of these brands that might have been more fitting for the theme? Let me know your thoughts. As per usual, I also wanted to mention that if you own any of these palettes and you wanted a little more inspiration, or maybe it's been a while and you wouldn't mind seeing the palette in action again, then let me know and I'd be happy to reach for one of these and do another fun little look. So yeah, that's going to be it for me today. Thanks again for taking the time to watch my little video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!